Last year, and it feels weird saying that, but we're officially in 2025 now. So Happy New Year, dear listeners. We hope you bid goodbye to 2024 in the best possible way and are looking forward to the new year with optimism and enthusiasm. But I digress. On 19th December 2024, Niti Aayog came up with a report on their Site Adjacent Factory Employee or SAFE Safe Accommodation Initiative. This is a plan to provide affordable, secure, flexible, and efficient housing for industrial workers. Why is this important? Well, India is looking to increase the manufacturing sector's GDP contribution from 17% to 25% by 2047. This vision demands a robust workforce strategy, including sufficient, proximate, and affordable housing for industrial workers. Niti Aayog said that inadequate housing near industrial hubs is a major bottleneck to these lofty ambitions. It found that poor housing conditions lead to high attrition rates, reduced productivity, and workforce instability. Moreover, it said the lack of suitable accommodations restricts the migration of workers, particularly women, thereby limiting the sector's growth potential. Now let's be clear, industrial housing as a concept is not new. It's been around since the era of the first post-independence state-run steel plants, and we've seen several iterations of it over the decades. But this is different. This is probably the first time that large-scale dorm-style industrial housing projects that are very common at electronics manufacturing units in China, Taiwan, and Vietnam are making their way to India. Tamil Nadu, for instance, has led the way with the government inaugurating the Vallam Vadagal industrial housing project in Sriperumbudur in August, which was exclusively for Foxconn. The project can accommodate 18,750 workers, making it the largest of its kind in India. And by the way, it screams Chinese-style industrial housing of the kind that Foxconn has in cities like Zhengzhou. Foxconn themselves have built another dorm-style housing project within their Sriperumbudur campus, which can house another 18,000 employees, while Tata Electronics is building their own version of the same, very close to their Hosur plant. All of this signals a new wave of industrial housing projects, which could be a key theme for India in 2025. But what is the biggest difference between the manufacturing waves we've seen in the past and the one we're witnessing now? How will dorm-style housing impact societal structures? Is this dorm style of worker housing only being adopted by electronics manufacturing giants, or will other sectors follow suit? Is the government doing enough to incentivize this? Which are the countries India can look to for inspiration and learnings? We cover all of this and more in today's episode as we speak to a top policy wonk. So don't go anywhere. It's Thursday, January 2nd. I'm your host, Diya Rekhi, and you are listening to India Plans China-Style Dorms for its Workers, only on the Morning Brief from the Economic Times. According to the Economic Survey 2023-24, India needs to generate 7.85 million jobs annually until 2030 to sustain its economic growth trajectory. A significant portion of these jobs will come from the manufacturing sector, which is increasingly categorized by large-scale mega factories. These facilities require a centralized workforce, often composed of migrant workers, to maintain competitiveness and achieve economies of scale. And now, with India's manufacturing sector at a critical juncture, addressing workers' accommodation challenges is a priority. Niti Aayog's report points to inflexible regulations, financial constraints, and inadequate private sector participation having created significant gaps in the availability of quality housing. This is where their Safe Accommodation Initiative aims to offer a comprehensive framework to bridge these gaps. It includes developing long term dormitory style housing near workplaces, providing essential amenities like water, electricity, and sanitation, reducing commute time, improving worker well being, boosting productivity, as well as limiting worker migration, particularly for women. But to understand more about some of the biggest takeaways from the report, as well as the broader discussion about worker housing, we speak to Dhruv Shekhar of Cohen Advisory Group to talk about the opportunity, the challenges, and the pitfalls. Listen in. Thank you so much, Dhruv, for joining us on the morning brief. Just wanted to kind of get your thoughts firstly on Niti Aayog's recent report that came out that was specifically targeted at industrial housing.
Yeah.
What were some points that really, stood out to you?
I think there's been a good deal of scholarship, which has also preceded the Niti Aayog report by a different organization. But I think what the report really thinned down to this one idea, which was really about problems pertaining to zoning regulations and how those are creating issues insofar as industrial housings can be created. So effectively what's happening is that you have certain zones which are deemed to be industrial zones, so residential setups can't be created. And effectively, the report is trying to address that whether we can move to a mixed format zone wherein you can provide residential housing in industrial setups as well. And I think they basically keep emphasizing that insofar as worker housing is concerned, you need to have a different metric as opposed to what you do for standard commercial or residential buildings, because this is being made for a particular, size and purpose. And say, for instance, parking requirements will not be as apparent in the case of, say, worker housing, because the socioeconomic class that we're looking at here will not necessarily be looking at buying vehicles, at least not in the interim. So there are things which can be relaxed in order to ensure that broader amenities can be provided, and also to ensure that just the kind of dysregulated, setups that workers stay in, and particularly we see this like in the Delhi NCR region with respect to the garment industry. If existing land can be utilized in an effective manner, that can just provide for a better, living conditions for them.
Definitely. But Dhruv, just zooming out a little bit, right? One of the things that I wanted to really get you to give our listeners a perspective on is about why this wave of manufacturing that India is targeting is different from the waves we've seen earlier. Now, I live in Chennai, and we've seen the Fords of the world come to India and set up their manufacturing plant, but nothing like this, industrial housing project that we are seeing the government also being very keen on. Is it something specific to electronics manufacturing which is, driving this wave, or is it something else?
I would say, I think when we look at the pre-liberalization era, I think there was an emphasis both from private players as well as the government sector to varying degrees that when you're creating industrial units, manufacturing units in setups in places, there has to be an ecosystem-centric approach to it. So I think if I was to kind of give an example of, say, Bhilai as a region or an industrial belt, I think if we see what we see today is, I think it's a germination of an idea from a public sector understanding that proper housing, health facilities for workers across classes is essential to kind of develop that as a place which is livable and people can actually work. Likewise, I think the Tatas have been pioneers in this. I think Jamshedpur is a great example. I would also say there's a Modi group of companies used to have Modi Nagar, which in the 70s, 80s, 90s was a major industrial hub for a variety of textile and cotton mill manufacturing. I think cut to the period between 1990 to 2015, so what we saw with the white-collared worker class decided to move to more of a CTC style arrangement, wherein they did not want, say, housing arrangements be included as part of their remuneration and them having the freedom to choose as to where they wish to stay. I think insofar as the blue-collared workers are concerned, I think the Niti Aayog report reflects on it, and wherein they also talk about the fact that there is this whole informal economy which emerged in terms of housing setups, wherein, say, for instance, if you're looking at the garment manufacturers or folks who work there, they stay in places which are simply shanties and slums. I think you give an example of, I think, Chennai and I think particularly the automobile manufacturers, right? From time to time, automobile manufacturers have created these worker housing facilities. So, for instance, I'm based in Gurgaon. Maruti has, I think, in the 80s, in the 90s, and even as late as, like, I think 2020, also built up something known as, I think, the Maruti Enclave. But the difference there was A, the size of land holdings that they were creating were smaller, and B, they were operating more in an ownership based pattern wherein workers could buy out those things. What's changing, I think, with electronics manufacturing broadly, when I compare it with, say, traditional and age old industries like automobile, would be one, this. When we look at smartphones in particular as one subset of the electronics value chain, you need more generation of products from time to time. And what's happening is that if you are not able to create integrated worker housing arrangements, then if you want, say, to increase and amp up your sales in India, that objective is not fulfilled. And where that becomes complicated in a larger scheme is that I think we often see it when we talk about this whole China plus one model, wherein we talk about how manufacturing is kind of getting dispersed from China to different parts of the world. The competition is simply centered around from the fact that can they negotiate a greater degree of investment in their respective zone if they can actually showcase it to the global heads that that specific region is the best possible bet for the foreseeable time to invest more, and as a result which to be able to derive more in terms of cost productivity. And I think that's really the game changer that we're seeing happen, because there is, I think, an established understanding to really convey and convince their own investors, their own global partners that, India is the place to be. And I think that's really where, this push is coming from.
Right. So would it be right to say that, say, for instance, Foxconn is sort of leading the charge, at least in India, when it comes to having these kinds of facilities, right? We're talking about townships and, that entire Foxconn city kind of model being replicated in India as Apple looks to ramp up specifically here. You're seeing even with Tata Electronics that they are setting up worker housing at their Hosur facility. So it seems like the electronics manufacturing companies are really looking at this, and we're going to see more of that. But do you see other companies also wanting to follow suit? Like you said, you are having discussions with clients and so on.
I think one arena that I've been part of conversations, or at least I've heard from people who are in the mix of these conversations, is on the footwear and retail side. So we've seen a lot of Taiwanese contract manufacturers in the footwear space set up shop in recent years in Tamil Nadu. There's also been a historical trend dating back to, say, the early 2000s, but I think that's picked up in recent years. So as you're seeing a greater push happen on the non-leather footwear side, that's one domain that when I kind of think of even the worker involvement per unit, I think it would perhaps even be more than, say, some of the electronics manufacturing industries, whether it could be a Fengte, whether it could be Indian majors like Lakhani, like Mirza on the footwear space. I do reckon that, there's a possibility of them recognizing the value of these kind of setups and perhaps even wanting to work with state governments to develop.
Sure. You mentioned state governments, and that is a point I'd like you to highlight a little bit more because, when we speak of this kind of housing, you think of China quite often, right? Especially for electronics manufacturing. And I've spoken to many people who've, sort of studied the China model when it comes to housing. And they said that in China, it's the government that really pumps in huge dollars to really make that kind of housing happen. So will Indian states have to sort of step up in that regard and really pump in the money, especially initially?
I think definitely, these special purpose vehicles, which are being kind of developed to kind of provide some sort of viability gap munting, I think Indian states, and I think I can name a couple right off the top of my head, be it in Uttar Pradesh, be it Gujarat, Tamil Nadu is obviously there, similarly with Karnataka, and Andhra and Telangana are also keen on getting, a greater share of the manufacturing of India. I think definitely there is scope for them. And I think, also a fundamental issue that I think the report also reflected on, that setting up these housing facilities, that's not necessarily the competence of these companies. And the second thing is it also makes them open to different kinds of liabilities, which would make them resistant. So if state governments are keen on, a greater share of the manufacturing pie to their respective states, I think it's imperative for them to get their hands and work with these private sector partners, whether it's financially, that's definitely required on one level, but also I think on a regulatory side, how do they ensure that, a set of ecosystem players can come in who can operate on the build, operate, transfer type model insofar as these facilities are concerned? Because previously certain companies have attempted to create these dormitory style housing facilities for workers, but when that hasn't happened because the unit economics of it in terms of a certain proportion of the worker salary going to just these rental facilities not working out. Those plans have been abandoned, and instead they've shifted to, say, student housing, which was a far more viable alternative from a cost lens. So I think those things, states definitely have a role to play. And I do feel that I think the central government's been doing a very admirable job over the last decade in terms of steering this initiative, because it requires participation from different players. I think they too will have to kind of steer these conversations to ensure that all stakeholders are on the same page, and synergy where required is kind of put in place there to get things moving.
Do you see similar setups now coming up in, say, Dholera or in Assam and so on, where we are seeing sort of like these large semiconductor projects come up as well? Do you foresee this being something that they might look at as well?
I think, first of all, we also have to kind of understand what are the kind of workers that they're getting. For more specialized workers, I think particularly in Dholera, we'll see a lot more expats coming in, particularly insofar as the initial tech transfer know-how bit. So I think there will be housing facilities which will be there, but they may be of a different scale and size, which might be created. Similarly, I think in the semiconductor industry, class definitely does play a role in terms of these conversations, in terms of how the housing facilities are made. I mean, that's a reality that one should acknowledge, that, we see that happen. So I do expect some level of worker housing facilities being created, but to what extent that will be and whether that will mirror the same scope and scale that we're seeing in Tamil Nadu, I think that remains to be seen.
I wanted to also get your thoughts on how you see this from a sociological perspective. You're seeing these huge sort of townships come up near factories. Many of them don't really have too many facilities around them. I know that, now there is a concerted effort to, have recreational facilities around these townships and these living facilities.
Yeah.
You mentioned the whole public sector setup earlier, right? Where you had quarters for employees, but that was a family setup. Here we're looking at dorms for women who are young, maybe unmarried, possibly married, staying away from their families, those kinds of things. How does that change the societal setup and societal makeup in a sense?
I think that's actually a very interesting and perhaps an equally difficult question to answer. I think what we really need to move towards is to ensure that if we want women from different parts of the country, right, to really be able to come out of the household and work, there has to be a setup or a facility which allows for family networks to evolve and develop and not be operating in this sort of a splinter cell manner. I think right now what we've seen is that perhaps a big part of the reason where we see heightened female labor participation, particularly in these industrial setups, is largely concentrated in the southern part of the states. If we want more of that to happen, we need to kind of ensure that different style of housing setups can actually come into play, wherein you can see that family type structures can move in and stay together, where members of that family unit can work together, or they can be working in different facilities and stuff, but they can have a healthy, cohabitable social setup as work goes along. I think what we've seen in different countries also, whether it's China, whether it's Japan, even Vietnam more recently, which has, I think back in April of last year, had announced a scheme to ensure that, greater social housing is made, and the government's going to be funding it through different mechanisms, whether it's easy access of loans. It's very critical to ensure that, family setups can operate together in unity. Otherwise, I think over a period of time, those retaining workforce or retaining talent can be an issue.
Right. And of course, another factor for retaining talent will also be how well the overall safety of workers is protected, right? I mean, do you think that will have to be relooked at given the massive scope and newer contours of the work involved? Also, will women's safety be critical in that regard?
I think there has to be some level of emphasis to ensure that what are the kind of facilities that will ensure that if you are going to have mixed or like mixed gender setups, how do you ensure that safety of women is ensured? I think that's going to be a very critical element that many of these entities are going to be placing deep focus on. Fresh-esque facilities will be critical. If there are night shifts which will happen, because if we want to kind of mirror China in terms of the kind of shift-based work that particularly happens in the electronics manufacturing, how will that operate when it's transplanted into India? What are the kind of safety regulations that they need to account for? I think that is something which there will be a lot of scrutiny on, and I think rightly so. to ensure that, these setups can both be havens for industrial productivity, but worker safety as well. And I think that's something for us as well to kind of keep a keen eye on.
Sure. How crucial is the whole third party ecosystem to service these large industrial housing projects going to be? And I ask that only specifically because of what we've seen with Foxconn itself, right? A couple of years ago, they had that huge food poisoning incident. Now, you can have large facilities, but if you don't have the right third parties to kind of operate and run those facilities, it could mean a lot of trouble for these big companies because they will be hauled up for every third party lapse that's there, right?
So I think what I see it is an opportunity, in the sense that if this becomes a viable medium, that basically means that you have a set of players who could be, real estate developers who kind of build a place and then they transfer it to you. There could also be a set of stakeholders who are already in the ecosystem, or they can transition their business model, who can build, operate, and then at some point maybe transfer that setup to you, or operate it, on a contractual basis for a period of time. So I think that's certainly what I just see is like an opportunity for people who are exceptional at managing these kind of scales, whether it's security, whether it's food safety, whether it's health. But given past experiences, that outsourcing will also happen with greater level of scrutiny, like stringency in terms of the checks and the quality assurance that they do. I think that's certainly going to figure in terms of the sort of vendors who will operate in this space.
Are you seeing some interest from established real estate players, for instance, wanting to get into this space, specifically with industrial housing and worker housing projects?
I think, it's an interesting thing. I mean, some of the major real estate developers operating in and out of Karnataka as well as other parts of the country, what they had highlighted there was that, there is always going to be a massive difference in terms of the number of people who are there who want housing in India and the per units that are created every year. However, I think for this domain to kind of pick up as like a mass segment, I think the unit economics of like renting for workers has still now not picked up. So I think I would still say there might be some level of interest, and they will very closely watch how these pilots as part of the SAFE project pan out. And I think on the basis of that, we can probably make estimations about their interest. I think that would be as educated a guess that I can make at this juncture.
Coming to last year's budget, Dhruv, we saw that the finance minister had also spoken about industrial housing. She spoke about the need for, public-private partnership and this whole viability gap funding and so on, right? We have, the next budget coming up pretty soon. Do you see this being something that the central government will talk about more? What are your expectations regarding industrial housing, in the budget this year?
I think when I look at, the Niti Aayog report, it very clearly indicated that I think there's going to be a pilot phase of this whole SAFE program, which will be initiated. Now, I think once they've been able to figure out the financials with respect to that, I think that may figure in, or alternatively, I think that might happen at a later stage. Where I see the budget reflecting a bit more, as they have, and I think in recent years, is I think in terms of the ease of doing business element. I can certainly imagine that there might be some sort of integrated push to ensure the zoning laws, the FAR provisions. Now, it remains to be seen because many of these are within the purview of states in terms of how they want to kind of bring those down. But I'm not sure if we'll see some other major announcement in addition to what has already been mentioned, I think, a couple of months back with respect to the viability gap funding.
We're seeing the likes of Foxconn and Tata Electronics really stepping on the gas to have these large dorm-style industrial housing projects for workers. And as India aspires to touch $300 billion in electronics production, including $100 billion in exports in the coming years, the success of these endeavors also relies heavily on social infrastructures, and states are waking up to this. Taking a leaf out of Tamil Nadu's playbook, other states like Telangana and Gujarat are also looking at ways to develop townships around large industrial facilities as investments pour in for the electronics and semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem. But in all this, it's important to learn from the mistakes that others have made. In China, for instance, these dorms became symbolic and part of the sweatshops allegedly run by these electronics manufacturing majors. And India wouldn't want to make this mistake. We also want to make sure that social isolation and the reproductive health of these workers is adequately addressed, apart from, of course, the basic issues like wages and so on. We'll keep our eyes and ears open, and you keep tuning in to TMB. It's going to be a great year with many exciting episodes. Thank you, Dhruv, for your time. It's Thursday, January 2nd. I'm your host, Diya Rekhi, and you were listening to India Plans China-style dorms for its workers only on the Morning Brief from the Economic Times. This episode was produced by Surohini Jain. On sound, we had Rajas Nayak and Amrit Reddy. Executive producers Anirban Chaudhary and Arijit Burman. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday. It streams on Amazon Prime Music, JioSaavn, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and of course ET's own audio platform, ET Play. Thank you for listening and have a great day.